The loss of women's right to vote. There is a false perception that human rights arise from logical thinking or common sense about what is just. This is false. In human beings, both common sense and the perception of what is just are programmed. This programming can be called ideology. However, ideology is a construct that arises after the establishment of right. Therefore, right is something that precedes logical thinking, common sense, or the perception of what is just. Consequently, it is necessary to answer the question, what is or underlies established right? Every human or legal right is based on the ability of those who establish or grant it to exercise sufficient violence to enforce it. It is for this reason that women's right to vote is granted by men, since they are the ones with the power to enforce it. Women's right to vote began to be granted by men around 1910. The Spanish who arrived in America were a few hundred men and occupied the territories of Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, where hundreds of thousands of Taino Indians lived. To justify their occupation of these territories, the invaders declared them to belong to the Spanish crown. The Spanish obtained the right to declare these territories as belonging to the Spanish crown based on their ability to exercise the necessary violence to impose it. Later, the Spanish forced the Indians to work for them and used them as slave labor. The Spanish obtained the right to declare thousands of Indians to work as slave labor based on their ability to exercise the necessary violence to impose it. In other words, they did all of this based on the law imposed by the strongest. In Mexico and the rest of Latin America, they did the same thing, based on the right granted to them by their capacity to exercise violence at a level far superior to that of the Indians. In fact, Hernán Cortés conquered Mexico with a handful of Spaniards who formed the crew of his ships, and they defeated the Aztec Empire, which had millions of men. Before the Spanish, the Aztec Empire forced other conquered tribes to pay tribute. The Aztecs forced the other conquered tribes not only to pay tribute in goods, but also to give them a tribute of young people to be sacrificed on the altars of the Aztec gods, where their beating hearts were cut out with a stone knife. The Mayans did the same. The Aztecs and Mayans derived the right to demand the sacrifice of human lives to their gods from their superior capacity to exercise violence against other indigenous tribes. Consequently, for the other tribes populating Mexico, the Spanish conquest represented a major step forward, moving from an extremely cruel and bloodthirsty slave system to a comparatively humane one. The English did the same in North America, taking the Indians' lands, based on the right granted to them by their greater capacity for violence. Later, the North Americans took from Mexico the territories of Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, and California that the Spanish had taken from the Indians. The right that the Americans had, and continue to have, to take these territories from the Mexicans, to this day derives from their capacity to use the violence necessary to enforce it. The Spartans had a population of around 30,000, while the Helos numbered around 250,000, more than 8 times the population of the Spartans. However, the Spartans enslaved the Helots and allowed their adolescent boys to go out into the countryside to kill a Helo as proof that they were men. This enormously unjust right was established by the Spartans because, despite being very few in number compared to the Helots, they had a greater capacity for violence. The establishment of ideology and its relationship with established right. While it is true that the right of peoples, or of men, or of social classes, or of genders, to subjugate and govern others is based on the former's capacity to exercise violence, the truth is that for this established right to remain stable over time without being questioned, an ideology must be generated to justify it, and consequently serve to legitimize the status quo in the psyche of the population, and thus give it stability over time. An ideology is or constitutes an explanation that justifies the established social order. That is, it constitutes the worldview that explains, in a nutshell, the natural order of things, and consequently, the rule of law. Ideologies serve a dual purpose. On the one hand, they shape the consciences of those who will not enjoy privileges in society, and on the other, they soothe the consciences of those who will enjoy privileges in that society. The Spanish and the English would not have been able to subjugate the Indians indefinitely until the present time, given that the Indians were more numerous and were constantly seeking ways to rid themselves of those who subjugated them, especially by copying the superior technology of Spanish and English weapons of war. What enabled the conquest of the Indians in the long term, up to the present day, was the incorporation into their psyches of the ideology that explained to them the position they occupied in society. If the slaves had not incorporated the slave ideology, to the extent that their population had a greater capacity than that of their masters to exercise violence, they would not have been able to enslave them in the long term. If the Helos had not incorporated the ideology that explained their position within Spartan society, the Spartans would not have been able to enslave them for long, since the Helots were much more numerous than the Spartans. Once an ideology has been internalized by society's various interest groups, violence is no longer necessary to impose the status quo. To the extent that all interest groups internalize and accept the prevailing ideology, the false impression is created that established law emanates from the natural order and not from the capacity to exercise violence of those who established it. That is, to the extent that everyone internalizes the same conceptual framework or worldview to explain each individual's position in society, the violence that underpins that established natural order becomes unnecessary and remains underlying. As can be seen, every right is based on the ability of those who establish it to exercise violence and impose it, but in the long term, it is the ideology established to justify that right that perpetuates it without having to exercise violence. However, there is a widespread misperception among both women and men that women's right to vote is the result of the struggles they have waged to achieve this right. There is also a false perception that this right cannot be taken away because the prevailing ideology dictates it, and this ideology cannot be changed. In this article, we will present arguments that contradict these misconceptions. The destruction of the patriarchal ideology of the family and its replacement by the matriarchal ideology. For more than 5,000 years of history, men deprived women of the right to vote until, around 1910, they decided to begin granting women the right to vote. If women's right to vote had emerged from women's struggles to impose it, why did they wait 5,000 years to do so? Wasn't men's treatment of women in Persian, Greek, Roman, medieval, and Renaissance civilizations extremely poor? Why did they wait so long? It's more than evident that the one who grants women the right to vote is the one who deprived them of that right for more than 5,000 years of history. The right to vote for women, established by men since 1910, has been used by women to gradually destroy the patriarchal ideology that existed for more than 5,000 years of history and replace it with a matriarchal ideology that mistreats and abuses men, subjecting them to a state of inferiority under the law that privileges women. Even though men are the ones who grant women the right to vote, and even though men have the capacity to exercise sufficient violence not only to impose it on society, but also to take that right away from women, women have nevertheless used the right to vote to persecute and punish men, and to request and obtain preferential treatment under the law, while men are denied such basic rights as the right to the presumption of innocence. In other words, a woman can accuse any man of sexual harassment and does not have to prove it. A man is presumed guilty and forced to prove his innocence when the person accusing him is a woman. Furthermore, it has been established that the crime of sexual harassment can occur even if the man did not intend to commit it with his words. It is enough for the woman to have perceived in her mind that a certain expression or gesture made by the man make her feel sexually harassed, and this is sufficient for a crime to be committed. Furthermore, the woman can trace the alleged harassment or crime back 20 or 30 years when there are no witnesses and it is impossible or very difficult to obtain exculpatory evidence, and yet the man is accused and forced to prove his innocence. Furthermore, in cases where the man proves his innocence, the woman is not required to make any kind of restitution for the harm caused, nor to pay attorney's fees. In other words, the right to the presumption of innocence, which every citizen enjoys until proven guilty, does not apply to men when the person accusing them is a woman. Simply put, men and women are not equal before the law. Women enjoy privileged treatment that men are not entitled to simply because they are men. How is it that women have been able to subject men to such inhumane and discriminatory treatment without men protesting and rebelling? The explanation lies in the establishment and internalization of matriarchal ideology in men's psyches. For 110 years, from 1910 to the present, women have been using the enormous power that men granted them by granting them the right to vote to persecute and punish men through laws that inferiorize them as human beings in relation to women. Concomitant with this process of persecution and punishment of men, a matriarchal ideology has been generated and established, and the consequent destruction of patriarchal ideology as a way of organizing the family and society. The origins of this matriarchal ideology are located in the first exponents of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism such as Simone de Beauvoir, 1908-1986, Michel Foucault, 1926-1984, Jacques Derrida, 1930-2004, Kate Millett, 1934-2017, Shulamith Firestone, 1945-2012, etc. Many of them claim to be Marxists in their dialectical analysis of social reality when developing their theories. However, when we examine their Marxist reasoning, we discover that they are incapable of correctly applying Marxist dialectics. However, despite their flawed Marxist analysis, they have been successful in convincing others of their pseudo-scientific theories. The destruction of patriarchal ideology and the promotion of matriarchal ideology have been achieved through the creation of organizations that follow these outdated pseudo-Marxist theories, whose purpose, as they themselves state, is to empower women and replace patriarchal society with a matriarchal society. In Puerto Rico, these organizations are the Feminist Coordinator Under Construction, an organization that operates internationally and is funded by George Soros, the Women's Caucus in the United States, the National Women Political Caucus, NWPC, the Me Too movement, etc. All of these organizations have one thing in common. They are all funded by the Antichrist, George Soros, through his foundations. This is the same person who funds LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism around the world, with which he uses to generate soft coups. How Soros and the businessmen of the globalist agenda increase their profits by using women and proponents of radical feminism, as well as proponents of LGBTI gender ideology, to generate soft coups is explained below. In the United States, as well as in other countries, organizations similar to all of these that operate in Puerto Rico operate. To the extent that men have been bombarded for 110 years with the propaganda and promotion of this matriarchal ideology currently promoted by these Soros-funded women's organizations, to that extent they have accepted the destruction of patriarchal ideology and its replacement with matriarchal ideology. Consequently, to that extent they have accepted their position of inferiority to women without protest, resistance, or violence. After all, That is the function of all ideology, to shape the minds of those who do not enjoy privilege and to soothe the minds of those who do. That is why women do not ask for, but rather demand their empowerment over men, using their right to vote, which men granted them. As a consequence of the enormous power that men grant women by granting them the right to vote, as they constitute more than 50% of the electorate, women have succeeded in passing laws that violate men's human rights. For example, the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. In the case of men, this presumption does not apply when the person accusing them is a woman, and she is accused of sexual harassment or gender-based violence. In such cases, it is up to the man to prove his innocence, and the woman is presumed to be telling the truth, even if the alleged sexual harassment occurred 20 or 30 years ago. Furthermore, women do not have to identify themselves and do not have to be subjected to cross-examination because, according to the law, this makes them suffer double humiliation. How do women use these privileges granted to them by law before men? Let's see. How do women use the privileges they have over men to persecute and mistreat men? We can identify two main areas where women use the privileges granted to them by law over men to persecute and abuse them. One is in the political arena, and the other is in the personal arena. Persecution and mistreatment of men by women in the field of politics. In the political arena, it is common for men competing with women for political office to be accused of sexual harassment or gender-based violence. In this way, women running for political office derail their competitors. It is very easy for women aspiring to political office to find other women who, echoing the ideologies of LGBTI gender and radical feminism, accuse their male political competitor of having sexually harassed them or committed gender-based violence. Accusations of this type arise not only for recent events, but also for events that occurred in the past. Accusations for events supposedly occurring 20 or 30 years ago are becoming more frequent every day. Thus, the then PNP gubernatorial candidate of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi, was accused of sexual harassment in the midst of the 2020 election campaign by his personal trainer. Notice L. Sexual harassment allegations rocked Pedro Pierluisi's campaign in the final stretch. See quote 1. Ambición 1. www.noticel.com. Elecciones. Top. Stories. 2002-2031. Alegaciones de acoso sexual estremecen campana de Pedro Pierluisi en la recta final. In the governor's case, the female coach was not held accountable for the damages caused with the full intention of derailing Pierluisi's election campaign. Thus, Hector Dupre, then candidate for representative of Puerto Rico for the Citizens Victory Party, was also accused of gender-based violence by his own wife during the electoral campaign. Notice L. Nestor Dupre resigns after accusation of alleged pattern of gender violence. The Citizen Victory movement called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. See quote 2. Quote 2. HTP www.noticel.com ahora la cal case Nestor Dupre is charged with a legacy patron of gender violence. In Dupre's case, they managed to completely derail his campaign without those who orchestrated the accusation having to answer for the damages they caused. Nor, in the governor's case, did the female coach have to answer for the damages caused with the sole intention of derailing Pierluisi's electoral campaign. Thus, then 2020 U.S. presidential candidate Joe Biden was accused of sexual harassment for events that occurred more than 30 years ago, the sole purpose of which was to derail his candidacy in favor of a woman. BBC. Tara Reid, a woman who worked with Biden nearly 30 years ago, is accusing the now presumptive Democratic presidential nominee of sexually assaulting her in the halls of Congress. See quote 3. Quote 3. https www.bbc.com Mundo Noticias Internacional, 54 en 1954. Tara Reid also did not have to answer for the damage caused to Biden's election campaign. This is how the current governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, was accused of sexual harassment by 6 women. France 24. 6 women, including 5 former aides, have accused New York Governor Andrew Cuomo of sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior. See quote 4. Quote 4. https www.france24.com ESEEUUE Canada 2012 Andrew Cuomo, Governor New York accusation sexual harassment, persecution and mistreatment of women by men in the personal field. Aside from the use of the privileges granted to women by law to abuse men in the political arena, these abuses by women extend to their personal lives by accusing them of domestic or gender violence in their marital relationships, or of sexual harassment in their personal relationships during dating, or in courtship and pre-dating relationships. In all these cases, women are granted the exclusive right to accuse their husband, ex-boyfriend, ex-suitor, or ex-lover of sexual harassment or assault, not at the time the event supposedly occurred and the person doesn't have much money, but 20 or 30 years later when the person has money and is sued for compensation. Such is the case with Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, former Hollywood producer, Matt Lauer, NBC host, Charlie Rose of CBS and PBS, etc. Or when he or she aspires to an important government position, as is the case with the aspiring U.S. Supreme Court justices, Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Brett Kavanaugh, despite having lived exemplary lives, were accused of sexual harassment by women during their confirmation hearings. What a coincidence! The accusations were not made at the alleged time they occurred decades ago, but precisely when they were being considered for Supreme Court justiceship. At the very moment they are being considered for confirmation, these 2 women are presented as innocent and naive, almost saintly, victims of alleged events that occurred decades ago. In Justice Kavanaugh's case, when he was a teenager. See quote 5. BBC World. April 26, 2018. United States. Comedian Bill Cosby found guilty of 3 counts of sexual abuse. Quote 5. https www.bbc.com Mundo Notícias 4.1547 BBC News World. February 24, 2020. Harvey Weinstein. The powerful former Hollywood producer has been found guilty of rape and sexual assault in a key case for the Me Too movement. See quote 6. Quote 6. https www.bbc.com Mundo Notícias Internacional 5600 Free Press. January 23, 2019. Chris Brown denies sexual abuse allegations and prepares slander lawsuit. American singer Chris Brown, who was released without charges Tuesday night in Paris, denies having had sexual relations with the woman who accuses him of raping her, said his lawyer Rafael Chiche. See quote 7. Quote 7. https www.prensalibra.com Vida. Escenario. Chris Brown rejects accusations of sexual abuse against his part and prepares a complaint for slander. France 24. 29/11/2017. Matt Lauer, the NBC News star, accused of sexual harassment and fired. NBC News abruptly fired its famed anchor Matt Lauer, who was very popular in the United States, on Wednesday after a colleague accused him of sexual misconduct. The news comes more than a week after another star host, Charlie Rose, was fired from CBS and PBS following the publication of testimony from 8 women accusing the celebrity interviewer of sexually harassing them. See quote 8. Quote 8. HTTPS basbweb.france24.com ES post 2701-129 Matt Lauer, la estrella de NBC News, acusado de acoso sexual y despedido. September 25, 2018. Who is Anita Hill and why did her case re-emerge in the Judge Kavanaugh scandal? CNN. In 1991, when Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas faced allegations of sexual harassment, the one thing that was said and repeated publicly about men in the Senate and elsewhere was, they just don't get it. Now in the Me Too era, men understand this and have lost their jobs because of it. Bill Cosby will have to serve between 3 and 10 years in prison. Such is the new environment facing current Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, as he faces accusations reminiscent of the 1991 Anita Hill incident. That context will undoubtedly influence how the current drama unfolds, as will today's intense partisanship and Republican control of the Senate. 27 years ago, Thomas, the nominee of Republican President George H.W. Bush, was confirmed by a 52-48 vote, the closest Supreme Court confirmation vote in more than a century, and with the help of 11 Democrats. It's impossible to imagine that kind of bipartisanship for a Supreme Court nominee today. See Quote 9. Quote 9. HTTPS dicanispanel.cnn.com 21809 25. Who is Anita Hill and why her case resurfaced in the Judge Kavanaugh sexual harassment scandal? Other cases of men accused of abusive behavior in Puerto Rico include that of Eliezer Ramos. Clarifying note: after this post was written, news broke that Bill Cosby had been released after serving his third year of a 10-year sentence. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that Cosby had been subject to a violation of due process by making deals with the prosecutor that weren't honored. In other words, he was tricked by a hysterical, man-hating prosecutor who didn't deliver on her promises. This news confirms my intuition regarding the validity of all these accusations against wealthy men in a climate of hysteria and women's protests. Who is going to pay Cosby for the 3 years of prison that an elderly man, 83 years old, had to unjustly endure? Now those same politically organized, hysterical women have promised to hound him wherever he goes and tries to rebuild his life or find work. Tell me this isn't a manifestation of hatred towards men for the fact that they are men. The ideology of matriarchy criminalizes men's roles in the courtship process, while keeping women's roles intact. Why do we say that accusations of sexual harassment by women toward men constitute abuse by women toward men? Ideology consists of the explanation and justification of humankind's conception of the natural order of things, that is, their worldview. Humans do not directly or objectively access reality, but rather through conceptual frameworks that organize external stimuli and provide human beings with a perception of reality seen through the prevailing conceptual frameworks or ideologies that act as interpretive filters for that reality. Ideology, therefore, is the explanation and justification of the social order established to address a social problem that must be resolved for group coexistence to occur. There are many problems that must be solved for a group to coexist as a group, society. For example, it is necessary to determine how society will be organized to generate the production of goods necessary for survival. It is necessary to determine how society will be organized to make decisions or govern itself. It is necessary to determine how society will be organized to reproduce the population. It is necessary to determine how society will be organized to satisfy the sexual needs of men and women, etc. When we say how society will be organized, we are referring to the sets of rules or patterns of conduct, roles, that will be expected of the different members, social classes, or genders into which society will be divided. Each of these aspects of expected behavior under different circumstances are considered in the construction of ideologies. Therefore, there is one ideology to explain the way in which man organizes himself to produce, and another ideology to explain the way in which man organizes himself to make political or governance decisions, and another ideology to explain the way in which man organizes himself to reproduce the population, and another ideology to explain the way in which man organizes himself to satisfy sexual needs. The way society organizes itself to produce entails an ideology or explanation and justification of the established economic system. That is, an explanation of the expected patterns of behavior from the different social or economic classes into which production is divided. For example, the ideology of slavery, capitalism, or socialism, etc. The way society organizes itself to govern itself entails an ideology, or explanation and justification of the established political system and the expected patterns of behavior from the different groups or social classes. For example, the ideology of democracy, the ideology of oligarchy, the ideology of monarchy, etc. The way society organizes itself to reproduce its population entails an ideology or explanation and justification for the type of family established and the behavioral patterns expected of both men and women in marriage, family, as well as in the period before marriage, the process or mechanism of courtship to form a family or marriage. For example, patriarchal ideology, matriarchal ideology, radical feminism, LGBTI gender ideology, etc. The way society organizes itself to satisfy sexual needs when one is single entails an ideology, or explanation and justification for the mechanism established for having sex. Mechanism refers to the behavioral patterns expected of both men and women in the process of having sex or copulation, the process or mechanism of courtship for having sex. The way society organizes itself to satisfy sexual needs for the purpose of forming a family, marriage, entails an ideology or explanation and justification for the mechanism established and the behavioral patterns expected of both men and women in the process of having sex or copulation, the process or mechanism of courtship for having sex with one's girlfriend. For example, a woman has to play hard to get and refuse to have sex at the first invitation. If she does it at the first invitation, it is to be expected that the man will think that she will not be a good wife and will not marry her. All this preamble is necessary to answer the question, why do we say that accusations of sexual harassment by women toward men constitute abuse by women toward men? Let's see. In both the courtship process for sex with the goal of forming a family and procreating children, and in the courtship process for sex and nothing more, the man is expected to initiate. In both courtship processes, there will be a set of rules of conduct or expected roles for men and women. For example, the way society is organized to satisfy sexual needs outside of marriage entails certain roles or patterns of behavior that are expected of both unfaithful men and unfaithful women in the process of having sex or copulation outside of marriage, a process or mechanism of courtship to have sex with a man or with a lover. For example, both married women and married men are expected to be discreet and conceal their extramarital sexual relationships from others. In both the courtship process for sex with the goal of forming a family and procreating children, and in the courtship process for sex alone, the man is expected to take the initiative. That is, in the process of achieving copulation to satisfy a sexual need in both men and women, there are established rules of conduct that are called the courtship process. Whether in the case of the need to reproduce or in the case of the need to have sex alone, the man is expected to take the initiative to approach and woo the woman, showing her, first with his compliments and then with his flirtatious actions, that he is sexually attracted to her. Women are not expected to take the initiative to approach and compliment or woo the man by showing him with her flirtations that she is sexually attracted to him. That is, women are expected not to invite men to have sex, as that is a behavioral standard that corresponds to men. On the contrary, women are expected to accept or reject men's sexual advances depending on whether they like the man or whether he has money or a good income. The passive role expected of a woman's behavior is partial. While she is not expected to make advances to a man, she may nevertheless flirt in an attempt to attract his attention, for example, by dressing up to look more attractive and sensual in order to attract his attention. This includes wearing low-cut tops to reveal her breasts, tight-fitting clothing to show off her curves, skirts to expose her legs, applying lipstick to make them more sensual, applying makeup, wearing sun hats, or sitting carelessly in a short skirt, etc. As we have pointed out, this ideology or expected sexual behavior between men and women is called the courtship process. In the case that the interest is to satisfy the needs of reproduction, that is, to form a family, it is expected that if the courtship process results in copulation involves a period of courtship during which the couple gets to know each other better, and if they decide to have a child, they either marry or live together. If the interest is simply to satisfy the need for sex, and if copulation arises from the courtship process, a period of sexual relations is expected, but without the intention of forming a family. In the latter case, if the woman or man is married, discreet behavior is expected from both parties. From the above, it follows that in the process or mechanism of courtship, neither the initiative of approaching nor the compliment by men can be criminalized because that would discriminate against men and not against women. If the initiative or compliment by men is criminalized by calling it sexual harassment, then women's exposure of their legs by wearing skirts, showing their breasts through a low-cut blouse, wearing makeup on their faces, showing their hair, and all other behavioral patterns, flirting, that allow women to attract a man for sex during the courtship process must be criminalized. Consequently, if a law is passed calling the role of men in the courtship process sexual harassment, another law must be passed declaring the role of women in the courtship process sexual harassment. That is, women's exposure of skirts, low-cut blouses, makeup, and the exposure of their lips, eyes, and hair must be criminalized. This is what is done in Arab countries, where women are forced to cover their heads, faces, and bodies down to the ankles to avoid sexually arousing men. Only a small area of their faces, over their eyes, is left uncovered so they can walk without tripping. Are the roles ideology assigns to men and women in the courtship process totally arbitrary as claimed by advocates of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism? Among their arsenal of pseudo-Marxist tools, LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism claim to be social engineers and point out that the established roles regarding the behavior of women and men, both in the courtship process and in behavior in general, are arbitrary social constructs that have no biological basis and can therefore be reprogrammed. This is false. This false premise, from which defenders of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism start, is what is expressed in Simone de Beauvoir's famous phrase, "One is not born a woman, one becomes one." But reality transcends these bombastic premises, which bear no semblance of truth. Men are very visual in their way of becoming sexually aroused, while women, on the other hand, are very auditory. Men are aroused primarily through their eyes, while women are aroused primarily through their ears. Both men and women are aroused visually and audibly, but men are primarily aroused through sight, and women are primarily aroused through hearing. Therefore, A law that criminalizes catcalling criminalizes the auditory sexual stimuli that men send or direct toward women, and does not criminalize the visual sexual stimuli that women send or direct toward men. Consequently, it is a law that discriminates against men while granting sexual privileges to women. Men become sexually aroused when they look at a woman's lips, eyes, hair, face, breasts, buttocks, and legs. For example, a woman's hair sexually stimulates men, regardless of whether the woman's hair is combed or uncombed, whether her hair is straight, wavy, or an afro. This is embedded in men's biology, where their primary source of sexual arousal is visual. That's why Arab men, to avoid this arousal, force women to cover their faces, hair, heads, breasts, buttocks, and legs. It's not that women aren't aroused if a man shows her his face, lips, mustache, beard, hair, or if the man wears a low-cut top and shorts and shows women his chest, buttocks, and hairy legs. However, this isn't the primary source of sexual arousal for women, but rather auditory. It's not that men don't get aroused if a woman tells him how beautiful he is and that he's the only man in her life, but auditory sexual stimuli aren't his primary source of sexual arousal. Visual ones are. No matter what a woman tells a man to make him feel unique, it won't turn him on any more than when a woman shows him her legs, her butt, her breasts, or her face and hair, in that order of importance. This very particular characteristic that women have of being more auditory than visual when it comes to getting excited or feeling passion for a man is masterfully represented in the famous play by French playwright Edmond Rostand entitled Cyrano de Bergerac, 1897. In that play, a very ugly man, because he had a very long nose, Cyrano, is able to make a very beautiful woman, Roxana, fall in love, defeating his rival who was a very handsome man, Christian, because he knew how to touch the woman's heart through his letters and the words he said to her. Wikipedia synopsis. Cyrano de Bergerac is a proud, sentimental, and poet soldier, but his greatest flaw is his ridiculously large nose. He is in love with a beautiful woman, his cousin Roxane, but as he is ugly, he doesn't expect love in return. Roxane, for her part, is in love with Christian de Neuvillette, a cadet soldier. Unlike Cyrano, Christian is handsome but lacks the protagonist's wit. Cyrano makes a pact with Christian to write love letters to Roxane so that he will at least be able to express his feelings to his beloved. Roxane, increasingly impressed by the spirit of his love, heartfeltly confesses to Christian that, although her love for him began with his physical attractiveness, now it was his soul she loved. This is devastating for Christian and euphoric for Cyrano, as she mentions that even if he were an ugly man, she would love him just the same. See quote 10. Aim 10. https://wikipedia.org Wiki Cyrano de Bergerac Teatro. As can be seen, the courtship mechanism described above is not entirely arbitrary, as advocates of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism claim, but rather has a biological basis based on the primary sources of sexual arousal for men and women. For this reason, it has been maintained in both patriarchal and matriarchal ideologies. However, in the case of matriarchal ideology, although the woman is expected to be the head of the family, the woman is not expected to take the initiative to approach the man to seduce him, nor is the man expected to assume the passive role of accepting or rejecting women's sexual advances. Nor is the man expected to assume the passive role of attracting the woman's gaze by unzipping his shirt to reveal his pecs or wearing shorts to show the woman his hairy legs. On the contrary, in the current established matriarchal ideology, despite the claim to be the heads of the family, it is expected that for a woman to find a partner with whom to procreate, it remains the man, not the woman, who must take the initiative to approach and woo the woman by making her see through his flirtations that he is sexually attracted to her. As can be seen in the current matriarchal ideology, because it is not developed as a natural process of cultural evolution based on the centuries-old experience of peoples, but as a process of social engineering, as designed by the defenders of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism who have become social engineers, there is no coherent mechanism but rather a contradictory one. In the current matriarchal ideology that has been established, it is expected that if a woman doesn't like the individual who takes the initiative to seduce her, she can accuse him of sexual harassment or ignore him at her discretion. If the man is rich or holds a prominent position, then she will report him for the crime of sexual harassment and seek compensation. If she likes the individual because he is good-looking or has money, she will accept his invitation and, once trapped in the marriage, she will keep him at bay by accusing him of domestic or gender violence. If she likes the individual because he is good-looking but lacks money, she will accept his invitation to enjoy him, even if she has no money until she finds someone who is good-looking and has money, or at least someone who has money, even if he is ugly. Once trapped in the marriage, she will keep him at bay by accusing him of domestic or gender violence. Another variant is when the man holds a position of importance, agreeing to have sex with him to obtain benefits and then rejecting him and accusing him of sexual harassment to obtain money. It is obvious that this matriarchal ideology that radical feminism has established to replace patriarchal ideology is totally inadequate to address both the problem of the reproduction of society and the problem of satisfying sexual needs because it establishes arbitrary treatment based on women's whims, which is cruel and inhumane towards men. When it comes to satisfying the basic need of every human being to have sex, it does not criminalize women's sexual behavior, while it criminalizes and imposes severe punishments on men's sexual behavior at the discretion of women's whims. The most pathetic thing about all this is that when the defenders of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism refer to roles and the system of social values, arguing that they have no biological basis and are merely social constructs of patriarchal domination, which they can redesign as if it were an exact science that only they master, which they call social engineering. The reality is that they are completely ignorant of the origins and functions of social roles and values. The only thing they possess as engineers is pedantry and grandiloquent rhetoric. The reality is that both the roles of women and men, as well as cultural manifestations regarding the way women and men dress, are highly influenced by the biology of men and women. For example, in Western culture, as we have already noted, the way women dress and groom themselves, combing their hair, wearing makeup, wearing earrings, etc., is based on the biological characteristic of men who are visual in their arousal. Consequently, in Western culture, the purpose of women's dress is to try to attract men's attention by sexually arousing them. In Arab culture, the way women dress, covering their entire body up to their head, is intended to try to prevent men from becoming aroused. That's why we say that if Western culture criminalizes men's roles in the courtship process because their sexual thoughts are implicitly sinful, the same must be done with women's roles because they have exactly the same sinful intentions as men. Consequently, we must prevent women from showing their legs, tight clothing, cleavage, lips, eyes, hair, and all the splendorous beauty that God placed in them, or rather in the eyes of men, male biology, to be enjoyed. There is no feminine beauty without male eyes to capture it. Without male eyes, women would be as ugly as men. If we don't want men to get aroused, all we have to do is have women dress the way Arab men dress, in loose clothing from head to toe, leaving a small slit across their eyes so they can walk without tripping. Is that the best way? The double standard in condemning the sexual conduct of men and not women. As can be seen, matriarchal ideology condemns men's behavior, the courtship process, to satisfy their sexual desires or needs as obscene and evil, while legitimizing exactly the same behavior in women to satisfy their sexual desires or needs. Classifying men's sexual behavior as incorrect, malicious, and obscene simply because it comes from men, and classifying women's sexual behavior as correct, without malice, and decent simply because it comes from women is a baseless prejudice. Assuming that extramarital sex or infidelity is only a male behavior is also another baseless prejudice. It is obvious that for every man who satisfies his sexual needs with a woman, there is exactly one woman who does the same with a man. Every day, hundreds of people in Puerto Rico have sex outside of marriage. The best evidence of this is that, in Puerto Rico, there's a motel industry used almost exclusively for discreet sex, so no one finds out. Why all the discretion? If he or she is single and not doing anything wrong, why spend money in a motel? Why not go to the house or apartment of one of the two? The reason is that these are married men and women having extramarital sex, or they are men and women doing something they don't want anyone to know about because they consider it obscene or improper. As you can see, for every obscene, unfaithful, or sexually improper man in Puerto Rico, there is an obscene, unfaithful, or sexually improper woman. It's the same in the United States as it is in Puerto Rico. Every day, millions of people in the United States rent a motel to have sex because they have something to hide. Consequently, for every obscene, unfaithful, or sexually incorrect or reprehensible man in the United States, there are the same number of women doing the same. Why is sexual behavior condemned in men but not in women? This approach to morality, implicit in laws that make it a crime for a man to try to seduce a woman, whether single or married, is based on the implicit premise that women are holy, without malice, and men are perverse. On the other hand, we see that any single man who wants sex and has nothing to hide brings a single woman, who also has nothing to hide, to his own house or apartment. However, according to the new laws to protect women, he is not safe from that woman accusing him of sexual abuse in the future. Any single or married woman who goes to a single man's apartment knows what she's getting into. However, when that man becomes a millionaire 20 or 30 years later, it often happens that the woman sues him for sexual abuse, and the law presumes that the woman didn't know what she was doing. Why is it presumed that the woman has no malice when she goes to the man's apartment, while the man is presumed to be the only one who acted maliciously? Of those men from whom women have extracted millions of dollars in damages and then sent them to jail, like in the case of Bill Cosby, who was the victim of whom? On the other hand, if 20 or 30 years later a man who is successful in his profession aspires to a political office or some important position in society, these moral laws that matriarchal ideology has established allow women to denounce them in order to put them in jail or derail their political aspirations and, in addition, sue them to receive compensation. All of this is possible because men have internalized the matriarchal ideology that establishes men's inferiority under the law compared to women as valid. This abuse of women by men must end. The kneeling men of gender ideology and radical feminism. Men who defend matriarchal ideology over patriarchal ideology play the same role of genuflection to women as the slave who defended the master's rights. When capitalism took root within the slave system, slaves who defended the slave system were called Uncle Tom. Men who defend the matriarchal system can be called genuflections of radical feminism or genuflections of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. A genuflecting man in radical feminism is one who suffers from Stockholm Syndrome or battered man syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is a term first used in Sweden in 1973 by Niels Bejerot to describe a paradoxical phenomenon of emotional bonding between hostages and their captors during a bank robbery in Stockholm. Gordon, 2005. Wong, 2005. Stockholm Syndrome refers to when a victim develops an emotional bond with their aggressor, identifying with them, even feeling responsible or guilty for the attacks they have suffered. The victim may begin to sympathize, empathize, and protect their hostage, even justifying their actions. In contrast, in battered woman syndrome, the person stops trying to end the abuse and instead develops defensive strategies in order to live safely, but with the possibility that they will continue to endure the abuse. The abused woman sees herself through the eyes of the abuser and accepts her guilt for the abuse. In Puerto Rico and the United States, we have many men who suffer from Stockholm Syndrome and battered man syndrome. Examples of men with Stockholm Syndrome include Juan Dalmau, Alejandro Garcia Padilla, and Ignacio Rivera. Examples of men with battered man syndrome include Pedro Pierluisi, Nestor Dupre, Joe Biden, Andrew Cuomo, and others. Frantz Fanon said in his work, The Exiles of the Earth, that a colonized man is an oppressed man who dreams of becoming the oppressor of his fellow countrymen. We can say that a man who defends LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism is a man oppressed by women and homosexuals who dreams of becoming the oppressor of other men. Look at the Puerto Rican issues that interest Dalmau. Noticel, 8, 2019. Senator Juan Dalmau, now a gubernatorial candidate for the Puerto Rican Independence Party, shared on social media that he's in the process of touching up the famous tattoo that revolutionized his previous gubernatorial bid. According to the senator, the purpose of his visit to the Puerto Rico International Tattoo Convention, being held at the Miramar Convention Center, is to promote non-discrimination against people for having tattoos. Taking advantage of the opportunity to touch up the tattoo and fix a few things is a way to raise awareness about Senate Bill 971, led by Dennis Marquez, which seeks to establish legal protections to prevent discrimination in the employment context against people who have tattoos or piercings, Dalmau explained. For Dalmau, the important things in politics are tattoos and the mutilation of language with idiotic expressions, such as the use of inclusive language, all, and all. It is an attitude of total surrender, submission, and genuflection to the commandments and designs of women and homosexuals to persecute and punish other men. If Don Gilberto Concepcion de Gracias were watching from beyond the grave what they are doing to his party, he would die of shame again. The loss of women's right to vote as a consequence of its manipulation by the defenders of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. One attitude we learned from Karl Marx is to analyze social phenomena from a dynamic perspective, not a static one. Social phenomena are not what they appear to be from a momentary or immediate perspective, but rather what they actually become when we analyze them in their dynamics. The loss of women's right to vote stems from the dynamic forces that generate the manipulation of women by advocates of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. These groups are, in turn, financed by entrepreneurs of the globalist agenda who use them to generate soft coups in countries around the world. Later, we will explain what the business of generating soft coups entails and its connection with the entrepreneurs of the globalist agenda and the advocates of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. The interest of these groups is not to defend women, but to use their right to vote to promote laws that allow them to teach LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism to children in schools and young people in universities, and in this way destroy the traditional family formed by a man and a woman, and replace it with the homosexual family that can be a man with another man or a woman with another woman or any other combination within the acronym LGBTI. It can be scientifically proven that sexual behavior in animals is determined by biology, but that, in the case of human beings, sexual behavior is fundamentally determined by social values. If social values regarding homosexual behavior change, and instead of classifying homosexual behavior as incorrect, it is classified as correct, then a transition from a heterosexual society to a homosexual society will occur over the long term, over the course of several generations. There is abundant empirical and historical evidence on this matter. In ancient Greek, Roman, and Sodom and Gomorrah societies, homosexual behavior was widespread throughout the population. Scientific evidence is presented at the end of this article. The interest of organizations that promote LGBTI gender ideology is to promote homosexuality and hedonism in new generations by changing their cultural values and thus establishing a society where homosexual behavior is widespread throughout the population. To achieve this goal, they manipulate women so that, through their vote, they force politicians to establish absurd laws that authorize them to indoctrinate children in schools and young people in universities in LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. To achieve these goals or objectives, they dedicate themselves to convincing women that their greatest natural enemy is men, whether single or their own husbands, because they are violent and abuse and murder women. Consequently, women must use the right to vote that men grant them to force politicians to pass laws that punish men. Laws that deny men fundamental rights, such as the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, while granting women special privileges such as the right to make accusations against men, even without proof. All of this is done under the assumption that this is the way to reduce violence against women. But we must not forget that their main objective is to pass laws that allow them to indoctrinate children in schools and young people in universities with LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism, thereby accelerating the homosexualization of society. To do this, they employ a strategy that consists of creating the false expectation that violence against women is reaching record levels never before seen. In this way, they generate a state of widespread hysteria among women so that they pressure politicians with their votes to declare a national state of emergency that allows politicians and rulers in power to justify and, consequently, authorize the teaching of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism to children in schools and young people in universities as a way to prevent this supposed violence. What remains unexplained is what teaching new generations to be homosexual has to do with reducing violence against women. However, as absurd as these laws may seem, politicians pass them so as not to lose women's votes. This strategy they employ in Puerto Rico is the same one they employ in all other countries around the world, such as the United States, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, etc., and European countries. What is the reality? The reality is that never before in history have the murders of women been lower than they are today. This occurs despite the fact that, since laws were established to protect women from men, the murders of women have steadily increased every year in Puerto Rico and in all other countries where these laws have been implemented. If we look at the murder statistics in Puerto Rico, we will notice that murders of men are extraordinarily more numerous than those of women. In Puerto Rico, the murders of men at the hands of men in 2018 were 624, while the murders of women at the hands of men, or femicides, during the same year were 22. That is, of the total murders, 96.5% were of men, and barely 3.5% of women. But this 3.5% occurred in a year in which the murders of women increased by 100% from 11 to 22, that is, doubled. Therefore, Under normal conditions, they would be less than 3.5%, say 1.75%. Normal figures would be 98.25% for men and 1.75% for women. As can be seen, the murders of women are insignificant compared to the murders of men. The pattern of murders of women in the United States and other countries around the world is similar to that of Puerto Rico. Despite this factual reality, defenders of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism keep women in a state of widespread hysteria by projecting the false perception that the murders of women are increasing to levels never seen before, with the idea that women, with their votes, will help them get the government to allow them to indoctrinate our children in schools and our young people in universities in the homosexualization of society. What could be the cause of the 100% increase in murders of women from 11 to 22 in 2018? One hypothesis for investigation would be to verify whether this increase is due to the rise in women who, incited and manipulated by LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism, have increased their verbal, physical, and psychological abuse against men, and have increased the false and unsubstantiated accusations women make against men, given that women enjoy such privilege under the law. Women are encouraged by proponents of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism to increase their physical and verbal aggression against men, which in turn generates more reports of gender-based violence. The increase in unjust complaints against men for physical or verbal assault initiated by women in Puerto Rico, the United States, and other countries around the world could be causing an increase in the murders of women as a result of a legal system completely biased in favor of women and against men. Where does the dynamic created by LGBTI groups and radical feminism to manipulate women against men lead? Where does this dynamic created by LGBTI groups and radical feminism to manipulate women's votes against men lead? If we examine this dynamic in detail, it leads to the loss of women's right to vote. It's not true that women grant themselves the right to vote as a result of their struggles. The truth is that it's men who grant women the right to vote. Women are not the ones who impose their rights on society, not even their most basic rights. Every right is based on the capacity to exercise violence on the part of those who grant or establish that right. To say or believe that a woman's right to vote is a right imposed and upheld by women is a mirage that ignores reality. Every right is based on the capacity of those who establish or grant it to impose it, and that capacity is rooted in the capacity to exercise violence. Women cannot compete with men in strength or aggression. Therefore, it is only a matter of time before, as women continue to abuse men, the latter will eventually organize and decide to take away their right to vote. Why don't men rebel against the abuse of women? Why don't men organize to protect themselves from the abuses women are inflicting on them by using the right to vote that men granted them? Why don't men withdraw women's right to vote? As we've already pointed out, the reason is the internalization of matriarchal ideology in men's psyches. The current situation of man's subjugation to woman is analogous to the relationship between a lion and its tamer. The tamer in a circus keeps the lion performing tricks using a chair and a whip. This works as long as the lion believes that the tamer's chair and whip force it to obey the tamer and perform the tricks. The chair and whip play the same role here as ideology in humans, but the wise tamer knows that he should not use the whip painfully against the lion, because if he hurts and enrages it, the time will come when it will attack, and neither the chair nor the whip will save them from the lion. At this point, what prevents men from taking away women's right to vote is the matriarchal ideology that has developed since women were granted the right to vote. Men have internalized this matriarchal ideology into their psyches, which explains and justifies their inferior position in society compared to women as a result of being violent people who abuse women and also sexually harass them. Consequently, according to this matriarchal ideology, patriarchy must be replaced by matriarchy, which is a more just system based on the idea that women do not lie when they accuse men of violence or sexual harassment, and that women do not sexually harass men. This is not true, but if it is repeated constantly, it becomes an ideological truth. And ideological truths do not need to be proven. They are true by definition, proclaimed as absolute truths that require no demonstration. We know that women lie just as often as, or more often than, men. Furthermore, we know that women are not saints and that they have many ways of sexually harassing men and making dishonest advances. But ideological truths cannot be questioned. What will happen if men don't wake up and defend their rights? If men do not wake up and defend their rights, women will continue to increase the punishments against them through their right to vote. It is not correct to assume that women will conform to the current levels of oppression they have managed to establish with respect to men. On the contrary, it is to be expected that, unless another countervailing force emerges and consequently reduces or halts it, this oppression of women against men will continue to grow as time goes on. The most logical thing to happen is that each new generation of women will demand new sanctions to punish and oppress new generations of men in a continuous process of ever-increasing inferiority. We are already beginning to see glimpses of what women will demand in the future to continue oppressing men. For example, this frenzy of women's empowerment has led her to propose passing laws to make it easier for women to kill men by hunting them as if they were prey animals. They have proposed laws to make it easier for women to carry firearms, as well as laws to place electronic shackles on men accused of domestic violence. This would allow women to detect when a man is nearby, as the electronic shackle would indicate this, and with the firearm, they could hunt him down, as if he were a prey animal. Regarding these proposals to make it easier for women to carry firearms and to place electronic shackles on men, see Primera Hora Newspaper, December 11, 2019. Victims of gender violence will be able to obtain a gun more easily. See quote 11. Quote 11 HTTPS www.primerahora.com. Noticias, Gobierno Política, Notas, victims of gender violence will be able to obtain an easier weapon. Primera Hora Newspaper, May 25, 2021. Victims of gender violence. App warns when the aggressor is nearby. See quote 12. Quote 12 HTTPS. E-paper to primerahora.com. Primera Hora, 2025. Many might think that women will never demand such privileges against men, but it's only a matter of time. Who would have thought 40 years ago that men could be stripped of their right to the presumption of innocence when the person accusing them is a woman? It's estimated that in the last 40 years, 240,000 men have been accused of domestic violence and have been found not guilty. Can you imagine what it would be like if women had 240,000 innocent men in electronic shackles while they carried a firearm? Can you imagine what would happen when, by chance, they happen to be near each other anywhere, and the armed woman detects on her phone that the man is nearby? It's only to be expected that she will locate him and shoot him. Once he's dead, public opinion will be, he deserved it for getting close. On the other hand, a woman who wants to kill a man only has to look for him and accidentally meet him anywhere. The dead man will be unable to defend himself. It's only a matter of time before the internalization of matriarchal ideology in the men's psyche leads them to accept the passage of such women's empowerment laws. If this happened to the Helos, who, despite being far more numerous than the Spartans, internalize the ideology that justified their enslavement. Why can't this happen to men in Puerto Rico, the United States, and other countries around the world? Women will cause World War III if men do not intervene. But using women to persecute and punish men is not the only objective of those who promote LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. At this moment, the entrepreneurs of the globalist agenda are manipulating women in a very dangerous direction that threatens to generate a third world war. The situation is as follows. The manipulation of women by the entrepreneurs of the globalist agenda who finance LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism organizations around the world with the aim of generating soft coups only works in countries with populist democracies such as the United States, Latin America, Europe, etc. In countries with non-populist democracies like China or where, being populist democracies, they do not function as populist democracies due to charismatic leaders such as Russia, Belarus, Hungary, Poland, etc., the defenders of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism cannot organize soft coups because they are not allowed to. Since the interests of the globalist agenda's entrepreneurs are to put all these countries under their control, as they have done with the United States and other countries in the Americas and Europe, they force the politicians they have financed in the United States and other European countries to apply sanctions to countries like Russia, China, Belarus, Hungary, Poland, etc., that do not allow LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism to organize protests for the purpose of generating soft coups. These sanctions have serious damaging consequences for the economies of those affected countries. Affected countries like Russia and China have long been raising concerns about the possibility that this fascist persecution of their economies could trigger a third world war. It is well known that the development of atomic weapons in Russia and the United States is so extensive that if a third world war breaks out, life on the planet would disappear. On this particular point, see quote 13, 14, 15, and 16. Putin. The West will regret it if it crosses the red line with Russia, April 21, 2021. Cita, https youtube.com watch view 2XOZULVFSELA. Putin condemns coups and illegal politically motivated sanctions. April 21, 2021. Cita, https youtube.com watch VBDJ EKAEJG. Putin on Western sanctions. Russia will be sovereign or it will not exist. June 6, 2018. Cita, consciências babizo to youtube.com watch B7G Seba UJTGPC. Belarus protests in the feminine. October 8, 2020. Cita, https www.youtube.com watch ITVULIRIFENAPC. As can be seen, the manipulation of women by the entrepreneurs of the globalist agenda will generate a third world war that would mean the end of humanity. Men are called to avoid this war by turning their faces to God and taking control of society, preventing the manipulation of women by the entrepreneurs of the globalist agenda through the organizations they fund, based on LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism, from leading to the Third World War. What is to happen for men to rebel against the abuse of women? How can men be forced to stop accepting the pseudo-Marxist matriarchal ideology they have internalized and replace it with patriarchal ideology? For a group or sector of society to advance its cause, it must have the capacity to organize politically. For a sector of society to be able to organize politically, two factors must be present. 1. That sector of society must become aware of its existence as a group with particular interests, in contrast to another sector of society. That is, expressed in Marxist terms, that sector of society must transform itself from a class in itself into a class for itself. 2. That sector of society must find itself in a dialectical contradiction with the other sector that legitimizes its existence and its political organization. The conversion of a gender in itself into a gender for itself. For a segment of the population to rebel and for a revolution to occur, there must be a sector of society that establishes a new ideology that serves to denounce the problems generated by the current ideology and the solutions it provides to solve them. The dissemination of this new ideology requires the formation of political organizations to represent and promote them. This segment of the population charged with denouncing the current ideology and promoting the new ideology must be generated. Furthermore, the new promoters of the new ideology must be capable of generating the violence necessary to impose their ideology. Karl Marx used the terms class in itself and class for itself. For a social class to become an element of revolutionary change, it must transform from a class in itself into a class for itself. A class in itself is defined by its objective position with respect to the means of production, and a class for itself is defined by the class's consciousness of the interests of the class to which it belongs. Using these concepts from Marx, we could adapt them to apply them to the case of men as a sector of society whose interests conflict with those of the matriarchal ideology currently promoted by LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. Men form a gender in and of themselves through their objective position relative to the biological sex to which they belong. But they become a gender for themselves when they become aware of the interests of their gender and organize themselves into political parties to wage a struggle to prevent matriarchal ideology from imposing itself over patriarchal ideology. But men cannot become a gender for themselves as long as they remain prisoners of the matriarchal ideology that has internalized in their psyches that they are inferior before the law when they argue or fight with a woman. On the contrary, women constitute a gender in and of themselves that long ago became a gender for themselves by becoming aware of their interests as a gender and using the right to vote that men granted them to organize politically with respect to their gender and acquire privileges that go against men. These women's political organizations carry out proselytizing political campaigns in favor of those politicians who favor their demands. Consequently, as we have seen, they use their right to vote to persecute and punish men, managing to get laws passed that grant women privileges over men. Women, little by little, have allowed themselves to be manipulated by defenders of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism to get politicians to pass laws that allow them to destroy patriarchal ideology and replace it with the matriarchal ideology that promoters of LGBTI gender ideology advocate. And radical feminism have designed themselves as self-proclaimed social engineers. As we have pointed out, the interest of advocates of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism is not to promote the harmony and happiness of heterosexual marriage as the cell upon which society is modeled and reproduced through the education of the children born of that marriage, or social cell. Harmonious heterosexual marriage is what Christianity promotes when it states, "For this reason a man leaves his father and mother and joins his wife, and the two become one flesh." Genesis 2:24. Have you not read? Jesus replied, that in the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." Mateo 19:4-6. Let all of you hold marriage and marital fidelity in high esteem, because God will judge adulterers and all who commit sexual immorality. Hebrews 13:4. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. 1 Corinthians 6:9-10. But the harmony and happiness of a marriage between a man and a woman, as the fundamental cell from which to reproduce society by instilling values in the upbringing and education of their children, is not what LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism promote. That is what Christianity promotes. What they promote is the harmony and happiness of same-sex marriage between a man and another man, or a woman and another woman, as the fundamental cell of society and a model to reproduce in the upbringing and education of their children. Children they will not be able to produce because they are biologically disabled, and who would be forced to adopt them or pay for someone to produce them so they can indoctrinate them in the homosexual hedonistic ideology. Children whom they will educate and indoctrinate to become generations of homosexuals and defend their cause and their model of a homosexual hedonistic society. Therefore, the interest of the defenders of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism is for women to see men as their natural enemies, who must be persecuted and punished, with the idea that politicians will declare a national state of emergency that authorizes them to preach their hedonistic philosophy based on the pursuit of sexual pleasure in all its possible forms to children in schools and young people in universities. Their true interest is to promote the homosexual family as a cell from which to educate new generations and reproduce the formation of society. For the time being, men, although they constitute a gender in their own right, have assimilated this matriarchal ideology that has been gradually imposed on them over the years. Consequently, just as the slave in the slave ideology or the worker in the capitalist ideology, by accepting the place assigned to them in society, makes the slave or capitalist system stable over time, the man in the matriarchal ideology, by accepting the place assigned to him in society by women, makes the imposed matriarchal system stable over time. The purpose of a men's political organization must be to denounce this matriarchal ideology as unnatural, unscientific, because it does not accurately describe reality, and unjust. Furthermore, a modified patriarchal ideology must be proposed as an alternative to the unnatural, unscientific, and unjust matriarchal ideology. The emergence of a dialectical contradiction that legitimizes the existence of a party of men. An essential part of every ideology is the delegitimization of the activities or organizations that will be prohibited. If an organization goes against the prevailing ideology will use every possible means to prohibit that group, as well as its activities, by declaring them illegal. And this prohibition will become an inherent part of the prevailing ideology. This is why fascist political organizations, such as the Nazi Party, are prohibited in a political system based on democratic ideology. Similarly, racist political organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan are prohibited in a society organized around the idea that all men are equal. These prohibitions are an inherent part of the prevailing democratic ideology or egalitarian ideology. What happens when self-proclaimed pseudo-Marxist social engineers who manipulate LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism in their entanglement as pseudo-social scientists open the door to their own dialectical and self-destructive contradictions? For example, political organizations that promote the establishment of black political parties open the door to legality for the establishment of similar organizations of white people with opposing ideas, And the same thing happens with women's political organizations. Women's political organizations open the door to the existence of men's political organizations. Imagine what would happen if a black political party were organized. That would provide the basis for a white political party, like the Ku Klux Klan, and a subsequent civil war. That was what Malcolm X thought with the Nation of Islam Party and the Black Panther political organization in the United States. Black people had little chance of winning that war because they were a minority. Furthermore, it would not contribute to improving their living conditions. The most convenient thing to do was to develop an ideology that condemned racism and prohibited it, a strategy that would be capable of recruiting both black and white people against racism. That was what Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy thought. In his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," Martin Luther King established the strategy that the black movement in the United States should employ to be successful when he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." I still have a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. One day this nation will rise up and live up to its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This strategy proved to be the correct one in that it has served to this day to unite more white people to the black cause and to improve the living conditions, not only of black people, but of all minorities. The confrontation, the destruction and burning of cities, the destruction of statues, monuments, and history proposed by Malcolm X would only have brought about one of 2 things. 1. The loss of that war by black people at the hands of white people, and the consequent radicalization of racism in a racist society. 2. The fall of the United States as a hegemonic civilization, and with it the fall of the other Latin American and European countries that represent Western civilization, and that copy everything that the United States does as a hegemonic civilization. Fortunately, Malcolm X was an exceptionally brilliant person and realized in time that his strategy was leading to a dead end. Unfortunately, when he changed his philosophical thinking, he was assassinated by his co-religionists within his own Nation of Islam party. However, his contribution to the progress of black people in the United States is indisputable. Martin Luther King Jr. would not have been able to achieve all the success he achieved in advancing the interests of black people if he had not had Malcolm X as a counterpart, warning society that the alternative would be war. This is similar to what happened in Puerto Rico with Luis Muñoz Marin and Don Pedro Albizu Campo. Muñoz would not have been able to achieve all the success he had in advancing the interests of Puerto Ricans if he had not had Don Pedro as his counterpart, warning the United States that the alternative would be war, even if there was no chance of winning. Unfortunately, women, having allowed themselves to be manipulated by proponents of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism, have chosen the confrontational strategy of the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers in the United States. This strategy leads them to create political organizations analogous to the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers to unleash a war of persecution and punishment against men. A war they have little chance of winning in the long run, given that men are much stronger and more aggressive than women and were the ones who granted them the right to vote they now enjoy. Just as the creation of black political organizations like the Nation of Islam would pave the way for the legitimization of white political organizations, the creation of these women's political organizations paves the way for the emergence of male political organizations that would otherwise be prohibited within the prevailing ideology. Dialectical contradiction. The empowerment of women leads to the empowerment of men. The evidence that women have transformed from a gender in themselves into a gender for themselves is clear and overwhelming when we examine the large number of political organizations that have been established and that are aimed at what they themselves have called women's empowerment. For example, as we have already noted, the feminist coordinator under construction, the Women's Caucus, the Me Too movement, etc. The proliferation of political organizations to empower women in Puerto Rico is the best evidence that women long ago went from being a gender in themselves to a gender for themselves. Can you imagine the protests that would have arisen from the creation of political organizations to empower men if women hadn't done just that? For example, 25 years ago, in 1995, attempts by some men in Puerto Rico to organize politically to protect themselves from the abuse to which women subjected them failed, using Puerto Rico's Law 54, which allows women to imprison men based on their mere testimony. Apparently, this attempt by men to organize politically was harshly criticized not only in Puerto Rico, but in other countries such as Argentina and Chile, despite the fact that the men managed to gain the support of Doña Trina Rivera. On this particular point, see quote 17. The news spread in Argentina as follows. In Puerto Rico, men organized to be able to freely beat their women. A group of men organized in Puerto Rico, not to defend rights but rather to try to restrict them. The Commission on Fathers and Husbands' Affairs for Family Union was established with the express purpose of fighting for the amendment of Law 54, which criminalizes domestic violence. Mabel Barge, Indeso Mujer, Institute of Legal and Social Studies for Women. Balcarce, 357, 2000. Rosario, Argentina, 12, 1995. Dream 17. http base.ph info en fiche première des fiche première DFH d353 HTML. Fempress, Men Organize, Fempress in. Mujer Fempress, 1995-19, Chile, 167. In 2014, the men attempted to join the political group, the Commission on Parents and Husbands' Affairs for Family Unity. Apparently, their application to join was rejected. On this particular point, see quote 18. The Commission on Parents and Spouses' Affairs for Family Union. Ambition 18. HTTPS. OpenCorporates.com Companies. PR 139. 121. We regret not having been able to obtain more information about this organization, of which, apparently, no trace remains. Unfortunately, by continuing to create these women's political organizations from 1995 to the present, women have opened the door for men with the same right to do the same. This dialectical contradiction, prejudicing women's best interests, is the consequence of allowing themselves to be manipulated by self-proclaimed Marxist social scientists, engineers, who defend LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. As can be seen, these social transformations triggered by the decisions made by human beings, the establishment of women's political organizations, are not visible because they occur over time periods that encompass the existence of multiple generations. Consequently, they are not visible to human beings in the short term. In the short and medium term, men, by accepting the place that women have given them in the new matriarchal ideology, cannot become a gender unto themselves and are condemned to live under the humiliating judicial inferiority and deprivation of human rights in which matriarchal ideology has placed them. They are not entitled to the presumption of innocence whenever the person accusing them is a woman. They are presumed guilty until they can prove their innocence and are not allowed to confront the testimony of their accuser because this exposes her to double suffering. Faced with such basic and elemental needs as sexual needs, men cannot express their sexual desires because catcalling and the process of courtship have been criminalized for men, while women are allowed the privilege of accepting the catcall in courtship if the man is interested, or accusing him of sexual harassment if the man is not interested, and it is convenient for them to file a complaint in order to claim compensation. In other words, When it comes to expressing their sexual desires, women and men are not treated equally under the law. Men accept all of this because they believe it is the natural order of things, due to having internalized the matriarchal ideology that women have imposed on men. The matriarchal ideology imposed by women is what they call women's empowerment, converting a gender in itself into a gender for itself. However, women in their intoxication with newly acquired power fail to see that each step they take to continue their empowerment through machoism creates the conditions for men to awaken from their ideological lethargy, which confines them to second-class citizens in relation to women, and begin to develop gender consciousness. That is, to begin to transform themselves from a gender in itself into a gender for itself. I use the word Macarena to counter the new modality of feminist women calling men Macarans. This is verbal violence and therefore psychological abuse by women against men. Men must defend themselves with the same linguistic instruments with which they are attacked: thought control through language control. How to correctly apply the Marxist analysis of patriarchal ideology made by advocates of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. If the self-proclaimed pseudo-Marxist scientists or social engineers of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism were to correctly apply Marxist dialectical analysis, they would have to arrive at the following result. In the case of women's political organizations, the dialectic would be as follows. Summary 1. Based on the right of the strongest that men inherently possess over women, men grant women the right to vote as part of the patriarchal ideology since 1910. Thesis. Based on women's right to vote granted by men, women establish political parties to attack patriarchal ideology and impose matriarchal ideology. Antithesis. Based on the right of the strongest, the door is opened for the existence of men's political organizations with the purpose of eliminating matriarchal ideology and imposing patriarchal ideology. Summary 2. On the basis of the inherent right of the strongest that men possess over women, men eliminate the right to vote that they themselves granted to women in 1910, or on the basis of the inherent right of the strongest that men possess over women, men modify the right to vote that they themselves granted to women in 1910 so that their electoral weight is 50% of the man's vote. In other words, what Synthesis 2 tells us is that the final result of the dialectic or dynamic established by men in 1910 by granting women the right to vote is that women use that power to persecute and punish men by promoting laws that discriminate against them. This discrimination and persecution that women promote against men will eventually lead men to withdraw women's right to vote or modify it so that it cannot be used against men. The final result, or Synthesis 2, would be the establishment of a patriarchal ideology without women's right to vote, or a patriarchal ideology with women's right to vote, but modified so that women's vote cannot be used against men. This last alternative is the one we propose. Note that dialectical dynamics does not presuppose that history must be circular. This is why Synthesis 2 does not necessarily return to the previous patriarchy with unrestricted voting rights for women, Synthesis 1, but rather a return to patriarchy without women's voting rights, or to patriarchy with women's voting rights but modified so that women cannot vote against men, Synthesis 2. The latter presupposes a higher evolutionary stage than the previous patriarchy, Synthesis 1. The basis for the establishment of men's political organizations. As we have noted, women's political organizations have been established in Puerto Rico. Such is the case of the Feminist Coordinator under construction, the Women's Caucus in the legislature, the Me Too movement of women abused by men, etc. You can imagine what could happen if men decided to copy these ideas from women and organize the male coordinator under construction, the Men's Caucus in the legislature, the Me Too. Movement of men, abused by women and/or the Men for Justice movement, MHPJ. Imagine the hundreds of thousands of men who have been abused by women in Puerto Rico under false accusations and who would be willing to support a men's party to defend them against these abuses. If men who have been abused by women were to organize themselves into political parties or groups, as women do, it would mark the beginning of the end of matriarchy and its replacement by patriarchy. In Puerto Rico, more than 24% of male voters have been abused by women. This represents a figure of approximately 240,000 male voters. In contrast, the percentage of women abused by men is 0.7%, that is, less than 1%. This represents a figure of approximately 8,640 female voters. This figure of 240,000 men abused by women in Puerto Rico grows every year at a rate of 0.62% per year, meaning approximately 6,700 men are abused by women each year. One strategy to transform men from a gender in itself into a gender for itself by founding a political movement, the Men for Justice movement, MHPJ. To produce a revolution in society that changes the treatment of men, it is necessary to establish a men's movement. That is, it is necessary to transform men from a gender in itself into a gender for themselves. To begin this process, there must be one or more men among them who begin to denounce the situation of injustice. Men find themselves in and to call for the vote of men and women to change that situation. Men must be organized into movements such as, for example, the Coordinator of Men for the Defense of Their Rights, CHPDD, or the Men's Movement for Justice, MHPJ. When a well-coordinated campaign has managed to mobilize and unite the sympathy and vote of 70% of men, the triumph of the men's revolution would be inevitable. In Puerto Rico, there are around 2.3 million voters. If 47% were men and 53% were women, we would have 047, 300,000, 181,000 male voters, and 053, 300,000, 19,000 female voters. 70% of the men would be 070, 181,000, 762, 300 male voters. That would win the elections in Puerto Rico. The basis for mobilizing and gathering that number of 762,300 male votes would be the following. Currently in Puerto Rico, there are approximately 240,000 men abused by women after being accused of gender violence, even though they are innocent. Therefore, to begin with, a political campaign aimed at defending the rights of men unjustly accused by women would have secured the votes of at least 240,000 male voters. If we assume that the protest marches and political activities organized with each of these abused men managed to recruit 2 men for each one of them, then we would be talking about 240,000, 240,000, 720,000 male voters, which would be 72% of the male voters. If we add to that 30% of women who are aware of these injustices perpetrated against men and who decide to support men, the number of votes would increase by 1 to 9,000, 365,700. Consequently, the men's party would sweep with 720,000 is 365,700 wheat, 1 mortar 85,700 votes. In the United States, these proportions would be similar. Where do these numbers come from? Let's see. In Puerto Rico, around 6,000 men are accused of domestic violence annually. Only 3.6% are found guilty, and 94.6% are acquitted. This means that 94.6% have to suffer the abuse and mistreatment of having been accused without sufficient evidence. If we assume that men are exposed to this type of accusation from the age of 20, and that men eligible to vote are those who are 60 years old or younger, then over the last 40 years in which these policies of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism have been implemented, there must be at least 46,000. surveyed 240,000 eligible men who have gone through the bitter experience of being accused of domestic violence in Puerto Rico. But that's not all. In Puerto Rico, around 700 men are accused of sexual harassment annually. Only 1% are found guilty, and 99% are acquitted. That means the 99% have to suffer the abuse and mistreatment of having been accused without sufficient evidence. These men would constitute an additional base of potential voters. On this particular point, see quote 19 and 20. Puerto Rico Police, Domestic Violence Complaints, January to December 2019 and 2020. Ambition 19. httpi policia.pr.gov Estadísticas de Violencia Doméstica 1593 3 2531 a 1957 ECTB3. Puerto Rico Police, Sex Crime Complaints, January to December 2020. AIM 20. https policia.pr.gov Estadísticas, Delitos Sexuales y Maltrato a Menores. In the United States, these proportions would be similar to those in Puerto Rico. In the United States, there are approximately 231.9 million voters. If 47% were men and 53% were women, we would have 109 million male voters and 122.9 million female voters. 70% of men would be 109, 76.3 million male voters. With that, the elections in the United States would be won. The Democratic Party in the United States won the elections with 79.8 million voters, including both men and women. We can assume that 47, 79.8, 37.5 million men voted for the Democratic Party. If 70% of men vote for the Republican Party and only 30% of women do so, the Republican Party would sweep the next election with 76.3 million male votes and reserve 122.9, 36.87 million female votes for a total of 36.87, 113.17 million votes. Political strategy of the Men for Justice movement. In short, the political strategy of the Men for Justice movement will be to convince 70% or more of men that they are being abused by a matriarchal ideology that inferiorizes them under the law as human beings. These capricious laws are imposed by women to persecute and punish them for simply being men. To convince men that the matriarchal ideology they have internalized, of which they are victims, believing that they should not be treated equally under the law as women, is a false ideology that does not describe reality and whose true purpose is to get us to grant access to promoters of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism to indoctrinate our children in schools and our young people in universities. Convince men that they have a duty to rescue society and reestablish a modified patriarchal ideology, maintaining women's right to vote, but preventing them from using that vote against men. The pillar of patriarchal ideology would be that marriage, and therefore the family, is made up of a man and a woman, as established by Christianity. That patriarchy is better than matriarchy as a way of organizing society for reproduction, raising children, and perpetuating society. That is, as a way of organizing the family as the most basic unit or cell for reproducing society. We can expect this sermon to produce 70% of the male vote and 30% of the female vote. That would be sufficient to restore patriarchy, as it would constitute a force that would be difficult to overcome. That is, even if women account for 30% of men who genuflect before LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism seeking to maintain matriarchy, 70% of men would be strong enough to win and impose patriarchy. However, to the extent that the percentage of men increases, say 80% or 90%, and they proclaim the establishment of the patriarchal family, such that those who genuflect before LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism are reduced to 20% or 10%. To that extent, the restitution of patriarchy will be assured. Replacing matriarchy. The modified patriarchal ideology of the Men for Justice movement. The men's movement must proclaim the modified patriarchal ideology. The modified patriarchal ideology maintains women's right to vote, but they may not use it against men. The patriarchal ideology must spread this message. Men are naturally religious beings who instinctively seek God. Every man knows that there is nothing more powerful than God, and that he must obey his laws and commandments. No matter how strong a man feels, he knows that there is a God who is infinitely more powerful than he is, immortal and eternal, to whom he must answer. While every man must answer to God for his actions, other men have a firm resolve to hold him accountable for his actions here in this world. Every woman must know that if she wants to gain control over men's behavior, she must not do so through persecution and punishment, since men are stronger than them. They can gain control over what men do by teaching them Christian values from childhood, as Roman women did. That was what Roman Christian women did, and their success was so great that after more than 10 major persecutions, not counting the minor ones, to wipe out the Christians in Rome, they were unable to achieve it. The Christian message of the apostles resonated most deeply with women. Without detracting from the work of the apostles martyred for preaching Christianity, the truth is that Christianity survived as a result of Christian women teaching it to children. In the face of the persistent proposal of LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism to reduce violence by teaching children in schools and young people in universities the hedonistic values of homosexuality, Christian men propose teaching children in schools and young people in universities Christian values. What is the argument for maintaining that a hedonistic religion that is not based on any scientific evidence should be taught in schools and universities instead of the Christian religion? Christian men and women will press with our votes so that instead of teaching hedonistic values about homosexual behavior in schools and universities, Christian values are taught. To replace the current matriarchy with a modified patriarchy adapted to our times, it is necessary to repeatedly repeat the ideas or ideologies contained in the patriarchal way of organizing society. It is important to emphasize the superiority of patriarchal ideology over the current matriarchal ideology imposed on us by LGBTI gender ideology and radical feminism. The Men's Party will promote the following ideas. We must develop the strength to impose patriarchal ideology without taking away women's right to vote, so that we gradually generate the conversion of men from a gender in itself to a gender for itself, where women cannot use the right to vote against men, nor can men return to treating women as personal possessions or merchandise because they do not have the right to vote. A universal declaration must be made that a woman's right to vote is granted by men and cannot be used to persecute, punish, or treat them inhumanly as medieval men treated women. The creation of laws that make it a crime for men to express sexual desire for a woman, sexual harassment, while women are allowed to approach or express their sexual desires to any man must end. The creation of laws that effectively establish that a man is guilty of any accusation of sexual harassment or violence made against him by a woman until he can prove his innocence must end. That is, it is the person making the accusation, the woman, who must prove her accusation. The creation of laws that allow women to accuse men of sexual harassment or rape for incidents that occurred decades ago must end. All accusations of rape must be reported at the time the incident allegedly occurred. Laws should be established that allow male politicians or wealthy men to sue a woman for defamation if they cannot prove their accusation of sexual harassment, rape, or violence. This way, men like Judges Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh, who have been wrongfully accused of unproven crimes against women, can be compensated for the damages caused. In order to prevent women from using their votes to force politicians to pass laws that persecute and punish men, we propose the establishment of a non-populist democracy. What allows women to use their votes to persecute and punish men is the populist nature of populist democracy. If populist democracy is replaced by a non-populist democracy, neither women nor men will be able to use their votes to pressure politicians against any sector of society. On this point, see quote 21. Proposal to change the political system from a populist democracy to a non-populist democracy in Ambition 21. https nationalpolitics.com 2136. Propuesta para cambiar el sistema político por 100 F 100 BF 100 BC. The establishment of a propaganda organ as a means of disseminating the party's ideology. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, in his classic essay, What is to be Done?, explained the importance of creating a newspaper that would serve as an organ of propaganda and dissemination of the party ideas. Today, we have other resources to generate propaganda for the party through the internet, including the press, radio programming, and audiovisual media, videos. The Men for Justice movement must develop these media to disseminate its ideology. Portal of the Men for Justice Movement Foundation, MHPJ. The task of founding the MHPJ requires men and women willing to fight for this cause. The first step would be to recruit people willing to participate in this project. Once a sufficiently large group of people has registered, we can then move on to proposing individuals from the registered group to fill various positions within the MHPJ. To achieve this goal, we have created a portal where interested people can register. Its website address is www.movimiento Hombres Pro Justicia, nationalpolitics.com. 2. Strategy to convert men from a gender in itself into a gender for itself from within current political parties. What strategy can be developed to generate a men's political movement similar to the one women have established within current political parties? First, at least one member must emerge in any or all political parties to champion men's causes and attack laws that allow women to abuse men. Furthermore, they must promote the 7 ideas we listed in the preceding paragraphs to protect men's human rights. This member of the political party could determine, within a reasonable period of time, the degree of acceptance among men of defending their rights in the face of women's abuse. If the acceptance of the defense of men's rights were widespread, other political parties would eventually follow suit and seek out party members who would champion the men's cause. As this men's movement develops and grows, the goal of turning men from a gender in itself into a gender unto themselves will be achieved, just as has happened with women. The difference will be that men are much stronger than women, and that factor cannot be ignored. We shouldn't expect a member of a political party who stands up for men's rights to be an elected politician. The reason is simple. That elected politician would have reason to fear that his female voters would stop voting for him. Ideally, that party member wouldn't have been elected to public office, but would run for public office and try to overthrow his opponent by standing up for men's rights, just as women running for public office recruit their voters by standing up for women's rights so they'll persecute and punish men. In the case of Puerto Rico, a member of a political party who is not an elected official and who aspires to public office by defending men's rights may leave a statehood, state liberal, or independence party. In the case of the United States, a member of a political party who is not an elected official and who aspires to public office by defending men's rights may leave the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Once a men's movement emerges that captures 70% of the male vote, matriarchy, LGBTI gender ideology, and radical feminism will be over.